Thanks very much, Steve, for giving me the opportunity just to have a quick chat with this really inspiring group. And actually, a number of the things I want to say this morning are actually just reflecting some of the things that have already been said. So I've got a lovely big world there. Steve asked me to talk about insights on place from the Edinburgh study, my own research, and then what a vision for a centre might be and how it fits with the ethos and approach of the Edinburgh Futures Institute. I actually want to focus more on the first than the last two. I've got one or two things to say at the end, but I really just want to focus actually on the things that my own research experience might be able to contribute to some of these discussions. So just to say a little bit about me. So I am one of the co-directors with Susan McVie of this longitudinal programme of work that's been going on now since 1998. We're in phase 8 of the study. We've been following a group of young people who lived in Edinburgh from age 12 and they're now age 34. So we're back in the field with that. We've got multiple data sources, but got a lot of information about their neighbourhoods and their sense of identity that is connected with their neighbourhoods, and the nature of Edinburgh as a city, and Edinburgh actually as a city of villages and of areas and small towns. So although I'm going to talk a little bit about the city, it's actually seeing it as a kind of fractured set of small towns. I've also done work linked to this in relation to transitions out of experiences of homelessness, working with the Grassmarket Community Project, particularly undertaking life history interviews, doing a drama and a photography project with them, so multiple methods. And then finally, I'm really interested in design for health and wellbeing, and interested to hear last speaker talking about student involvement. I've been working on design charrettes with students and staff around prison architecture, around designing prison architecture for very distressed individuals, so what we would call in prisons the suicide cell, but how do you make that architecture something that is more supportive and more nurturing. I've run model villages projects with students, and also redesigning public space to support inclusion around the Cowgate, and particularly around Hunter and Nicholson squares within the city centre, which were notorious for high levels of antisocial behaviour and drug taking, and actually how do we redesign those to create a more inclusive environment and not actually reject and not do it as a kind of exclusionary tactic just to get rid of people who are seen as troublemakers. How do you actually design for inclusion? So I'm really interested in all the things we've been talking about this morning. So that's been a collaboration with researchers, students and artists as well as the community groups themselves and the people who were allegedly committing the antisocial behaviour too. So that's kind of my background. And I think what I focus on entirely in my research is just how much poverty and how poverty linked to area forms a backdrop to so much problem, difficulties, lack of flourishing amongst children and young people. And I show these maps a lot, so anybody who's heard me ever talk about my research will have seen these maps a lot. But I think they're absolutely fundamental to what we're trying to do in the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and more generally within the city region, deal within the university. So we divided Edinburgh City into 92 natural neighbourhoods, which we actually talked to a lot of the young people in our cohort about where they saw boundaries and how they navigated across the city. And so in creating these neighbourhoods, what we see in Edinburgh from doing these natural neighbourhoods is you get this pentagon shape of high levels of social deprivation. What we did was we mapped onto this as best we could census data on social deprivation and some indicators of it. And what you get is this pentagon shape. And this is something that has existed for decades. This isn't something, it doesn't matter how much inward investment there is, it doesn't matter how much community activism there is, it doesn't matter how much regeneration there is an attempt. We don't move beyond these areas. There's a stickiness to this kind of level of social deprivation. And everything in our study that is problematic for young people and their well-being maps onto those areas. So we have police recorded violent crime, we have incivilities observed by a cohort like vandalism, graffiti, burnt out cars, dog dirt in the street, incivilities, they map onto those areas. School exclusion, the 10 top most excluding schools in Edinburgh come from the areas of most deprivation, that there is actually a deprivation aspect to school exclusion, as we all know, and also the young people who ended up in prison in our study, they were most likely to come from those areas. So there is something about multiple deprivation that is very challenging for young people, that is area based. We also know within this this there, that kids move around these cities and there are different kinds of borders within each of these areas, but where they can and cannot go. So there are also inhibitors in terms of the geographies in which they inhabit. But what I find the most upsetting in some respects about this kind of nature of city dwelling is that we've known about this for 50 or 60 years. This is nothing new. We've done this research and we're finding things that everybody's known for decades, and somehow or other we're not able to move beyond it. And we know, I'm not going to go through, so I've got some slides here about some findings around the likelihood of being warned or charged by the police, getting a criminal conviction, and bad things happening. They're all much more intense, even when you control for all sorts of things. Living in the context of deprivation has a significant effect over and above everything else. So we know that kids who get convictions, kids who end up in prison are the ones who are most likely to come from those areas. And we also know that areas also have labelling effects on young people, that young people who come from certain areas, they get stigmatised by that area. And again, that's something that's not completely new. Everybody knows this. I've got a great quote there about kids in a car. My friend, this is one of the interviews we did. My friends had a car and we got pulled up by the police at the top of the road. 5 minutes later, this is actually a road in Edinburgh. It's that goes right through the north of Edinburgh. 5 minutes later, we got pulled halfway down the road. 5 minutes later, we were pulled at the bottom of the road. 3 stops by different police because we're young, we're wearing hats, and they're in an old banging car, that car. So those kids are labelled because of how they look and where they come from. And we know that contacts with justice entrench them in poverty, and we also know that poverty and contacts with justice from our research also entrench violence. So there's a kind of horrible dynamic that's happening within the lives of these young people, and it's poverty that is trapping them. And for me, I think that, and homelessness too, again, it's poverty begets poverty. People, we know from our study that people who are very poor when they were young are the ones who are most likely to end up being homeless, and homelessness is about rootlessness and journeying across cities. So it's almost as if poverty itself becomes entrenched within areas, and it becomes in itself a total institution. So Goffman writes about total institutions, a prison as having dramatic effects on your sense of identity and stripping your sense of identity. But poverty is this, and poverty within areas begins to become like a total institution, that kids in those areas feel abased, degraded, humiliated, and they disrupt, and actually they lose command of their world. And that is the effect of poverty on young people. They become trapped within it. And the kind of things that we need to do within our cities is to transform areas in ways that actually don't make that happen. So what I think we found generally, and this is something that just reflects what has actually been said already, is that what is needed is actually multi-layered types of intervention. That if you want to see, this is from Bronfen and Brenner and Martins, what you see is if you look at everything connected that is to do with child well-being, they're all different layers, from the interpersonal through the meso-level institutional framework within an area, the neighbourhood itself, its amenities, the schools, and then the wider sets of policies that impact on those. All of these are interrelated. So we have to take a much more holistic approach to design, which has also been mentioned by other people too, but actually really make it happen. Because one of the things that governments don't do well is work across policy portfolios. What local authorities don't do well is work across portfolios. Different portfolios are in competition for resources with each other, and they are, although they know they have to work together, they find that really, really difficult. But unless we can actually get that much more holistic look at understanding flourishing and well-being, and also communicating and working with people and listening to them, then we're not actually going to solve that problem of poverty that is sticky. And as someone was saying, with social solidarity is promoted by this micro connectivity, but it's also promoted by these more structural features. So it's looking at the micro and the structural as completely interrelated. So for me, when I talk about the Edinburgh Futures Institute and what we're committed to, we've got lots of great big vision happening within the Edinburgh Institute about interdisciplinarity, about focusing on global challenges. But we're also our ethos is actually the most important thing about what we're doing. It's about participatory ethos, about trying to co-design and work with communities, listen to communities, be advocates for communities, and also this very strong sense of data, making sure the data is there, and also this very strong sense of interdisciplinarity, that actually making universities, city councils, governments think holistically about what they're doing. Universities themselves are also set up in these kind of vertical ways, and we've got to kind of work like that. And that's the one thing, if we're going to design a centre to be transformative and to bring together all of the multiple layered things we need to do in order to be able to promote human flourishing, we have got to work in that kind of cross-disciplinary way with respect for each other and respect for the people that we're trying to work with. So that's all I really wanted to say, Steve. I'm not quite 10 minutes.